I'd like to ask two people who have been involved with Dr. Deming for a very long time, Carole and David Schwinn, to please come forward and share with us their lessons about the man and the mission. Please welcome Carole and David to the front.
All right, so as I said, what we really want to do is share some memories that we've organized around the man, the message, and the movement. By the man, we mean what are some stories that we'd like to share about our experience of Dr. Deming as a fellow human being. The message is obviously about what did we hear, what do we believe that we learned from Dr. Deming over the years, and then finally the movement. We truly believe that Dr. Deming just didn't bring to the world a set of practices or a set of principles or the 14 points or even profound knowledge, but he really launched a movement that we still see afoot today, not only in his name, but in the name of a lot of other people that all of us have continued to learn from. A movement really to create a world that works for all. So we'd like to speak a little bit about the small part we played in that movement as well. So let's start with the man, Chelsea, and go to the first slide, which is really David's response to how did he first meet Dr. Deming.
And this really does respond to your question. I first met him when I was sitting at the corporate quality office at Ford, and we were having a little bit of trouble. That's the decline in market share around the world, in the U.S., and you will find out that there was a reason for that. That's it. At that point in time, anybody who went in the United States in particular, and really in the world, who went up against Japan on an international basis lost. And we were in a place where we lost particularly badly. Ford Motor Company in the late 70s, we were really wondering if we were going to go out of business one more time. So it was serious business for us. When we tried to find out why we were losing market share, we found out that it was because people cared about quality. Seems like a duh, but that you might expect, we track what customers care about. And this was the first time they ever cared about quality. It was the first time that quality even got on the radar screen. They cared about styling, they cared about price, they cared about performance, quality not issue. Well, let me show you the next slide. And that's kind of why, and that's a messy slide, but let me give you the bottom line. In those days, if you bought General Motors car, you bought a Ford, you bought a Chrysler, called the big three, because we were the big three, quality was the same, essentially. On the other hand, if you bought a Japanese car, the quality was, to really simplify it, 4 times better. Let me say what that meant in those days. During the warranty period, and the warranty period was 1 year in those days, if you bought Ford, Chrysler, General Motors car, you could expect to go back to the dealership 4 times for, things got screwed up. And if you bought a Japanese car, you would go back once. That was a big deal. And so people thought, I've got a choice here. I would choose to only go back once. The other way to simplify that for me is a story. One of the things we did, because our management didn't believe this, and so we had to do a bunch of research. And one of the things we did was we went around the country and visited dealers, Ford dealers that also sold Toyotas. And so we would rumble through all the warranty records and all the service records and all that stuff, and we saw what we would expect to see for the Ford vehicles. But then we would go for the Toyota files, and there wouldn't be anything in there. And this happened over and over and over and over again. And toward the end of this study, we were in Beaumont, Texas. I remember this like it was yesterday. Big old guy, 10-gallon hat. I said, here's what's happening. Can you explain this? He says, Well, son, here's the way it works. We get a Ford in, we have to fix it before we can sell it. And then we sell it, and then they bring it back because all the stuff we didn't get around to fixing. We get a Toyota, we wash it. We sell it, we never see it again. That was the situation we were in. Go ahead, Chelsea. We, like many other people, it's interesting because I don't know very many people who even know what quality circles are anymore. But when one of the things we did to try to figure out how we were getting our rear end kicked was what's going on over there. So we did all the research, and we went over, and we looked around, and the only thing, honest to God, the only thing we could see, well, we did see that they stopped the assembly line, which didn't make any sense to us at all. But they also had, once a week, the foreman would gather everybody around and say, look, you know, what are the problems we're having, and what do you guys think we can do to fix them? And we thought, you mean people who do work have a brain? Now, we knew that we had read that in the literature someplace, but it was not the way we operated. So we took a chance, and we invented something called participative management, employee involvement, worked with the union, and began to solicit input from the people who were doing the work to try to do the work. Now, we did two things. We started that movement, and top management said, hey, quality's got to be better. Remember, quality's job one, maybe. And that made a difference, and our quality got better. It still wasn't as good as Toyota, but it was better. But there was another problem. And the other problem was this. Not only was our quality better, but we knew that our cost to build a vehicle, on average, was about $2,500 less than theirs. So every time they sold something, they made $2,500 more. That's not a good way to operate. You know what I'm talking about? And so we are still desperately looking for what else do we need to do to get competitive here. And along came everybody who knows about Deming Institute, knows about If Japan Can, Why Can't We? We, like everybody else, were looking for something, saw If Japan Can, Why Can't We? So we called him and said, would you want to consult with us? And he said, no thanks. And I mean, these are vice presidents of General Motors. When vice presidents of General Motors say, how about this? People don't say no thanks. So it was like running through 10 of the most difficult gauntlets you could ever, until he finally said, all right. And Jim Bakken, who was my vice president, said, it really took us convincing him that we would do anything he told us to do. We would do it, and that if we did it, it might make a difference in the world. Bakken was convinced that had we not convinced him that we would do what he said and make a difference, there's just no way he would have even bothered with us. Yeah, go ahead, Chelsea. So, one of the stories that really speaks to him is that when we were trying to figure out what he was talking about, which was not easy, because it may not seem so, what he has to say may not seem so revolutionary now, but in the 1980s, he would say stuff, and we didn't even, we made no sense to us. And so we said, I think there's something about the statistics, right? So we said, would you teach us about the statistics? And he said, I don't think so. He said that to us a lot. And so, but we kept pushing. We said, look, we said we need to understand this, and we just don't get it. And he said, well, there is one guy who might be able to teach you. That's the guy in the corner, Dave Chambers. And so what Dr. Deming would do, right, is he would come and talk to top management, and he would come and listen to the workers. That's what he did, and just over and over and over again. And Dave Chambers is the guy who taught us the stats. Go ahead, Jose. This is another lesson that speaks to Dr. Deming, I think. We're finally ready to sign a contract, right? And so we draft up a contract. I mean, we use, you can imagine, we use a few consultants. And we've got, a 20-page fine print contract, and we said, here it is, would you sign it? He said, I don't think so. So he pulled out his code of ethics, and he said, this is the contract. And we will work together forever. And until one of us dies. I don't remember exactly how he said it, but you got the point. And he was at that point 81, I think. And we honest to God, we weren't sure who was going to die first. And that was the deal. Handshake, off to the races.
Well, meanwhile, back at the ranch, I was working at Jackson Community College, which is just down the road from here. For those of you who are from Michigan, from those of you who are not, it's like here's the mitten, we're kind of down here. And we were in a world of hurt in Jackson, Michigan, let me tell you. Slide, Chelsea. For one thing, you may not know, and a lot of people didn't know, is that back then, Jackson, Michigan had the largest single concentration of auto suppliers anywhere in the world. And our auto suppliers were all hearing from General Motors and Chrysler and Ford that they needed to do something to improve quality and productivity or they would no longer be suppliers. Back in those days, the so-called Big Three were trying, at Dr. Deming's advice and other advice, to reduce their supply base, right? And so they were demanding that quality and productivity and cost was reduced or they would no longer be suppliers. And at that time, we were losing companies like crazy. If you can believe now, people are shocked when there's an 8% unemployment rate. Back then, we had a 22% unemployment rate in Jackson, Michigan, and I got to tell you, that's a world of hurt. And so my job was to go around and talk to local companies of all kinds about what kind of training they needed. And they all hauled out this letter from General Motors or Ford or Chrysler that says, you either improve quality and productivity or you die. And I'll tell you what, I had not a clue what all that was about. I had read a couple of things in Business Week about quality, and I heard that there was such a thing as quality circles. But I needed to figure out a way to help our local suppliers. So as the story goes, I picked up a Quality Progress magazine, and there was a little ad down in the corner that said, call PQ Systems in Dayton, Ohio. If you're from PQ Systems, raise your hand. Yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of PQ Systems people here, and they will recall what that was like. This little ad. I realized there was this company in Dayton, Ohio that maybe might be able to help me. So I dialed the phone and got it turns out a 16-year-old software developer who said he was PQ Systems World Headquarters, which was actually in the garage of the person who became our great friend, mentor, Dr. Michael Cleary. And so Sean passed me on to his father. And I said, hello, I'm in Jackson, Michigan. We have a lot of auto suppliers who are in a world of hurt. They need some kind of training. We need to help them. Can you help me? And he said, well, I'm going to be driving your way. I can stop by and see you. And he said, I've been invited to a 4-day seminar with Dr. Deming by a good friend of mine. And he said Dr. Deming in such a way with such reverence that I thought, well, this is a big deal. I had no idea who Dr. Deming was, but I said, oh, yeah, come on by. Well, it turns out the friend who invited him to the 4-day seminar was Dave Schwinn, which is a whole other part of the story that we'll share kind of the highlights. as we go along here.
Yeah, the highlights.
So at any rate, Michael came along, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But Chelsea, change the slide. What I really want to say about Dr. Deming as a man is that not long after that, David invited me to a 4-day seminar at Ford, and I was utterly thrilled and excited that I was going to get to meet the man. So here we are on the first day of the seminar at World Headquarters. I mean, I'm pretty excited about being at Ford World Headquarters. And I thought Dave was really good looking at the time. And so during the, oh, he still is, right. And so during the first break, Dave takes me by the arm and walks me up to the stage to meet Dr. Deming. And prior to going to the seminar, I had written Dr. Deming a letter and told him about some of the things we were trying to do with auto suppliers in Jackson. So we go up on stage and meet him, and Dr. Deming said, this is Carole Hannon, this is Dr. Deming. Dr. Deming took one look at me and walked away. I thought, oh, well, this is one of the thrills of my life. And so he walked very slowly over to his little table, picked up his calendar. If you've ever been to a seminar with Dr. Deming, you know he always had a million notes stuck in his calendar, right? And he picked up his calendar, he walked back to me, and he handed me an envelope. And he said, I got your letter, and I appreciated it, and I wrote back to you, but I knew if I put it in the mail, you wouldn't receive it until we had an opportunity to meet. So I wanted to put it into your hands personally. So that's one of my stories about the man, who he was.
Another, yeah, that was good, Chelsea. Another story, it was, and we'll talk about this later, but we were doing work in communities, and this was the Ohio Quality and Productivity Forum's first international annual Deming users group. And everybody was there, you can see. And I was going to do a presentation on the theme, which was a quote from Dr. Deming, let us say that no community need be poor. And so I'm setting up, and it was a room a little bit bigger than this, and I'm setting up before the thing, and just me, and then walks Dr. Deming. At least me, and I think a lot of people at that time were intimidated by Dr. Deming. And he walks on down. Hi, Dr. Deming. Hi, David. Sits down the front seat. And so I go on, and I start with my story. I'm about 10 minutes into my story. Dr. Deming rises. And those of you who remember Dr. Deming know he's a big man. So nobody can see me for Dr. Deming, right? And he says, David, it's very interesting, but unimportant. And he sits down.
I was in the back of the room, and I left. I said, I can't watch this. I can't watch him die here.
Well, I knew what he meant. And Bill Schirkenbach, some of you know Bill, was in the room, and so he helped me facilitate this, I thought, wonderful conversation for the remainder of the time about Dr. Deming's point, about the presentation was unimportant. And so I'm feeling really good because now I don't feel quite as intimidated as I used to. And Mike and Carole and I are talking, and Dr. Deming walks up and says, chuckling, he said, huh, I kind of stirred up the beehive, didn't I? And so I'm kind of, saying, geez, I'm sorry if I screwed up. He said, why don't y'all come all on over sometime and we'll just have a talk. And so, why don't you shoot the next one, Chelsea? So he invited us to Washington, and we spent the day with him talking about our work, and I at that point in time, I was particularly interested in trying to understand analytic studies. And oh, by the way, if you've got out of the crisis, I don't know if the answer to the question about analytics statistics is still wrong, but it was wrong then. And then he insisted. Now he's 86. He insisted that he was going to drive us over to the Cosmos Club for lunch, which was quite a trip. But we just had this absolutely delightful day, which, at least to me, speaks so much to how important it was for him to force people to think, and how incredibly kind and generous he always was to folks who he felt were trying to do his work.
Okay, Chelsea. All right, well, this is a photo that means a lot to us. We were able in 1985 to go to Japan with a group of people organized in Pennsylvania. There were 35 of us who attended the 35th anniversary celebration of the Deming Prize in Japan, which was an absolute thrill for us. Chelsea, you can move the slide. So we had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Deming address the people who were gathered in the room, and to celebrate that 35th anniversary of the Deming Prize. You can just switch, Chelsea. And this was a memento. This is another story about the man. The first night that we were in Japan, we all of our group gathered for dinner, and Dr. Deming met with us. And I don't know how it happened. I have friends in the room who would say that I shoved people out of the way to make this happen, but I really didn't. It just it just happened randomly that Dave and I were sitting at a small table with Dr. Deming and with Diana Cahill, Kevin's mother, and a few other people while we were having dinner. And as you can imagine, we were a little awestruck and felt very, very fortunate to be at that same table with Dr. Deming having dinner. And you would have thought that I would be the one asking for an autograph. But as we had dinner, he picked up our drink coasters, Dr. Deming did, and he said, I have an idea. Let's pass our coasters around, and let's each of us sign the coasters so each of us can go home with the names of every one of us at this table so that we can remember this moment forever. And I think probably, Kevin, I don't know if you've ever seen this hanging in your mother's house. I'm thinking we're probably the only people who gold framed it and hung it in our office. But it's something that we have certainly treasured forever, and it speaks to who he was as a human being, I believe.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Shifting to the message, we had the extreme good fortune to be invited by Seal Killian, who was Dr. Deming's very, very long-term one-person dynamo assistant who wrote a book about Dr. Deming, and she asked if David and I would write the introduction to it. So for the message, we'd just like to read that introduction. It tells you about what we learned.
We've come to know Dr. Deming as a special and loving person whose message and style are often misunderstood. Dr. Deming's primary message is that if you improve quality, you improve productivity. If you improve productivity, you can reduce price. With improved quality and lower price, you increase market share. With increased market share, you provide jobs and more jobs. So simple. But if you look beyond its simplicity to the vision it represents, the message is inspirational and profound. It's a vision of a world where we continue to reduce waste. Waste of time, waste of ideas, waste of material, waste of natural and human resources. It's a vision of an improved life for all people. For the worker who can do his job without having to cope with inadequate tools and equipment and materials, and who can contribute with his head and his heart as well as his hands and his feet. For the manager who can plan a future for the organization, and its people rather than fighting fires to survive for today. An organization free from fear, where workers and managers can work with pride and integrity rather than humiliation, fear, and mistrust. The vision ends cruel performance appraisal systems which arbitrarily differentiate between human beings and drive them to the mental health facilities, to the bars, and to the divorce courts. Barriers among departments within organizations are removed along with the counterproductive behaviors they create. Decisions are made for the good of the organization by leaders with constant purpose rather than for political expedience by managers afraid to do what's right. In a more global sense, Dr. Deming says no country need be poor and that no community need be poor. He makes the comparison of communities to Japan after World War II. Japan was left devastated, economically, psychologically, morally. They had nothing, no oil, no coal, no natural resources except for her people. Today, she still has no natural resources, but has created an economic miracle with people and good management. The analogy is clear. Many communities in this country have been severely damaged by economic hardship, have few resources save their people. What they need to develop is good management to accomplish Dr. Deming's vision of a better life for everyone. So the message is simple: eliminate waste. Even with minimal natural resources, a nation or community with a little leadership can pick itself up by its bootstraps. It can begin to learn to procure and convert natural resources into products and services customers want. The vision is so simple yet so revolutionary. The leaders of the world argue about how to divide up the pie while much of the world starves. Dr. Deming simply tells us how to make more pie so we can stop the fighting, stop the poverty, stop the hunger.
Those who are close to Dr. Deming know him to be a kind, dear, gentle man. He encourages, loves, nurtures, and patiently teaches those who try to communicate his message and who share his vision. But he's also demanding and impatient, and many have witnessed the style which can be intimidating, abrasive, and cantankerous. A short story may reconcile those contradictions for the reader. In November of 1985, we had the opportunity to attend the 35th anniversary of the establishment of the Deming Prize in Japan. Dr. Deming's address was critical not only of American management, but also of Japanese management and even of the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers, who have over the years been a primary conduit for dissemination of his ideas. His message was a warning that he was seeing signs of infection in Japanese management. More and more joint ventures were occurring where the American practices of multiple source purchasing and performance appraisal systems were being incorporated. He wanted to make sure that the Japanese system of performance appraisal and the Japanese philosophy of working with suppliers were not compromised. He was not gentle. Not one of the several hundred top Japanese executives walked away misunderstanding his message. Their reaction was consistent. They said, "He is our mother. He cares about our well-being, and sometimes he must scold us." Dr. Deming is biting and critical primarily by design because he has devoted his life to making this a better world, and he will use whatever means he can to communicate that. But there's another side of it. He gets impatient. He's only human, and he has seen how the world can be. He has seen a nice and Seiki plant where the quality, profitability, performance, and employee attitude levels are so good that their improvement task for 1985 was to make their plant look like a Japanese parlor room. A machining plant where you could eat off the floor. A plant which was home-like, family-like meeting areas everywhere, and a garden with plants and flowers and fountains and ponds inside. And he has also seen operations which are dirty and dingy and oily and inefficient and producing junk, and where employees are disheartened, fearful for their jobs, and unable to contribute to the well-being of their firm. Sometimes, just sometimes, he gets angry because American management can't see that there's a better way. So you see, we wanted to share our feelings for a man who has devoted his life to the elimination of poverty, the elimination of hunger, the elimination of war, the elimination of mental illness, and the general increased well-being of every human being on our planet. A man who has devoted his life with that kind of dedication and devotion and love surely deserves all the praise and love and support which we can provide. That's what we learned.
Yeah, one more. There you go.
All right, a little bit about what we saw as the movement. As I said earlier, we really thought at the time, and I guess continue to, think of ourselves and a lot of other people as a part of a movement to bring these ideas to the world. Chelsea, thank you. The first part of that is an initiative that was called the Transformation of American Industry, a national community colleges project. As I said earlier, I worked in a community college, and we started to work with local auto suppliers in Jackson, Michigan. And we started to get a little bit of notice about that and got calls from other community colleges around the country who were looking for some support. So we launched this program, the National Community Colleges Project, the Transformation of American Industry. And as Dave said, Dr. Deming had said community colleges have to do it. That's what he told us. They're in everybody's community, and learning has to occur in every community in this country. So he was very encouraging of that. Slide, Chelsea. This is a funny story about this. Do you remember the days when you did a conference and you had those binders where you slip in a thing in the front and you slip in the spine? Well, this is the night before the very first training of trainers that we were doing in Michigan, which was funded by the state of Michigan. Mike Cleary and Dave and I were busily stuffing these binders. We were so excited. First day of training the following day. And at one point, Dave brought me one of the binders, and he said, "Carole, look at the spine." And I said, "Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it?" And he said, "Carole, look at the spine." And it said, "The Transformation of American History." And we quickly replaced him because we were into rework. But we also have this one framed in our office because that's how we felt about the work that we were trying to do at the time, that we were going to help Dr. Deming transform American history.
I have to say I just love this because Carole's undergraduate major was in history, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I might have made this mistake, just possibly. Chelsea. And then, eventually that led to developing a series of training materials that were distributed for a very long time with the support of our friends at PQ Systems. Raise your hand if you're from PQ Systems.
Again.
We love them. Okay, Chelsea.
So we're working along, and one day Carole gets a call, and the caller says, if you weren't doing what you're doing, I'd be doing it. And Carole said, "Who is this?" And he said, "It's Myron Tribus." At which point she about fell off her chair. For those of you who don't know Myron, he was a vice president of Xerox, assistant secretary of commerce. He was the publisher of both Out of the Crisis and the New Economics. And he was, for us in particular, and I suspect for many people, the primary interpreter of Dr. Deming. As I said, somebody asked me earlier, I think we spent the first 6 months after we got Dr. Deming simply trying to understand what he was talking about. And Myron was the interpreter. Myron wrote and talked to us and did things that helped and bridged the gap. Because in those days, what Dr. Deming was talking about was so incredibly revolutionary that we just couldn't even comprehend it. So Myron said, "Okay, here's what needs to be done." And Myron was, I think, probably as passionate as Dr. Deming was about the need for transformation. He said, "Okay, we got to do this. We got to work with organizations. And then we got to come to create some kind of a large training system." And the community college systems is a good, large training system. Okay. Then we started on number one. We started on number two. He said, "But we got to do one other thing. In order for this thing to take, we've got to spread it community by community, rather than organization by organization. Community by community. Chelsea? So Myron invited us to Kingsport, Tennessee, Upper East corner of Tennessee, 86, I think. And brought a whole bunch of people together, every sector of the community, and said, what are we going to do? So we figured out something to do. And that work then spread all over the country and all over the world, and we probably worked with dozens of communities around the country. There's, for example, we work with North Simcoe in Canada, southern edge of the Georgian Bay. We worked with Jackson down the street, and stand up, Michelle.
Your picture's
Michelle,
in there, Michelle,
stand up.
from the old
See?
days.
Look,
Michelle.
Shanna, she's the only
here.
one of us who doesn't look a day older. And there's another person who hasn't changed a bit. Dick?
Where's Dick Steele?
He must have left.
There's
there
Dick
he is.
Steele. I stood by him last night, and I don't know, he's grown, I've shrunk. I think the difference is even greater now than it was then.
And then ultimately, I don't know, not ultimately, but part of the journey was Dr. Deming recommended that we go to New Zealand and take this kind of community approach to New Zealand. So we ended up getting a Fulbright Scholarship to hang out in New Zealand for a couple of years, trying to figure out how to apply community quality improvement to New Zealand. Go ahead, Chelsea.
And eventually there really were dozens. We've seen lists of community quality initiatives. A number of them certainly still exist, most notably CQI, which continues to hold the vision and do the work. Over time, we continued to learn from a lot of other people, especially as we were working in communities. We had the sense that we needed to take this idea of a whole system to a whole community. Among the people that we started to learn from were Dr. Russell Akoff, who a lot of you know. One of the things that he always said was he was one of the few people in the world who was allowed to call Dr. Deming Ed. And Russ's colleague from Iran, Jamshid Garajadagi, from a lot of other people, some of them in this picture from a teleconference that we did back in '83, right? With Peter Senge, some of you will recognize, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, with Meg Wheatley in the middle, who has become a dear friend. The older gentleman between Peter and Meg, you may not recognize his name, who is since died, but is Tom Barry, who co-wrote with Brian Swim the book The Universe Story, which if you're really interested in large-scale systems, you might want to read The Universe Story. It's probably about the biggest system story that you can read. So as we were learning and sort of trying to integrate all this theory, at some point we went to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation down the road from here, and they gave us a whole bunch of money to really take these ideas to our own community in Jackson, to begin to integrate the theories from Dr. Deming and all these other people that we were learning in a community, to actually engage people in the community in developing the ideal community, what they would create if they could have anything. Okay, Chelsea.
So one of the things that he taught us, and I hadn't thought about about this till just now, is you will remember this better than I, Kevin, but I think that he was on the Diaz, perhaps doing a 4-day, I'm not sure, only about 2 or 3 weeks before he died. So he was
10
10
days
days.
later.
So when I saw somebody who was so incredibly dedicated to their work that just refused to retire. I thought, why not? So my retirement is being a professor at Lansing Community College. And I'm going to tell you something really. This young lady here is one of the most wonderful reasons for being a professor. Another reason is you get your summers off. And another reason is you get a sabbatical every 6 years. So I got a sabbatical. And if you haven't figured this out by now, since I started working at General Motors, oh my God, 50 years ago, I've been, to say that I've been a little disappointed with the quality of management I've been exposed to is probably a bit of an understatement. And then a few years before this, I read a book that many of you are probably familiar with called The Turning Point by a guy named Fritjof Capra, who thinks that we're at an inflection point as a species, and that unless we change our ways, things are going to get a whole lot worse instead of a whole lot better. And I had come to conclude that it had something to do with consciousness. And so I decided for my sabbatical that I wanted to find the people who seemed to be more conscious than most of the rest of us. And I decided that I also couldn't just make this a casual study, because people would say, well, you know, it was just that company, or it was just that sector, or it was just that country. It was just so. So we ended up wandering around the world. And we talked to 45 people, and I'm not sure we hit 100%, but they were pretty darn conscious by and large. And 45 people, 14 countries, 4 continents. And so I did all my stuff I needed to do for a sabbatical. But the stories that we got from these folks were just too important. So we wrote the book. And we started it with, it's kind of like, who's the guy who says when you take the tour and you come back and you see, you end up,
Rookie, I think, yeah.
somebody, at any rate. You come back and it's the same thing. It's the same thing. You know, if you start, the transformation begins with me, and you come back to the transformation begins with me. And this is kind of the summary of what we learned. Somewhere beyond living to work and working to live, there's room for work that transforms us as we transform it, where we can grow lives of purpose and passion, where all people may prosper, and where we may contribute to a better and more peaceful world. And I guess that is just one of the things, and everybody in this room can share, I know, some of the manifestations of what they've learned from Dr. Deming, and that's just one of our most recent.
Chelsea.
Go ahead, Chelsea. So this is kind of the rest of the story. This woman's name, when Mike introduced us, was Carole Hannon. And I want to tell you our story because it was so important to us, but I have to tell you our story is not unique. I'll bet you there are a dozen people or even more in this place who could tell a similar story. If it weren't for Dr. Deming, we would not have had a chance to meet and work together professionally for 30 years, 30 plus years. And if it weren't for Dr. Deming, we would have never fallen in love. And if it wasn't for Dr. Deming, we would have never gotten married and had a chance for all these magical people to come together. And I have to tell you that each and every one of them is doing his work, each in their own unique way. It just doesn't get any better than that.
And that's our story, and we're sticking to it. So do we have a couple minutes? Great. Great. Sure.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I would like to do this to say, you know, if anyone has any questions, but raise your hand if you met or ever worked with Dr. Deming. A lot of you. Here's what I would love. My guess is that while we're talking, every one of you who ever met or worked with Dr. Deming was thinking about your own favorite story. And I would just love it if you would, you know, just raise your hands and tell a story. We sent out an email that was pretty open-ended. You know, we worked with a lot of really interesting people around the world over the years, and we just sent out a letter and said, we think that there are more conscious leaders and managers around the world, and we'd like to talk to them. Who should we talk to? And some people said, I have no idea. I never heard of anybody like that. And other people immediately sent us an email and said, you got to talk to Ravi Kant in Mumbai. You know, so we organized our itinerary around those people.
My name is Jane Norman, and during the same time, I was at Caterpillar Tractor Company, and Caterpillar and GM and Ford were very much in tandem. They worked together a lot. They had the same UAW. They did a lot of things. We were in a plant in Iowa, and if you know anything about Dr. Deming, he had roots in Iowa. And although we were right on the Mississippi, we were in the Quad Cities, and we were known as the other Caterpillar group because we actually used Deming where the rest of the corporation used Duran. And Dr. Deming would come to ASQC, at that time it was ASQC, every year and would come and speak. And one year, I can think, every year you got to see him, and we truly transformed this particular plant that started at 300, went to 3,000, went to 1,500, and did amazing things, won the Worldwide Quality Award for 3 years, and then closed. Yeah. 86. Yeah. And, but I remember, this is such a funny story, and it had to be about 84, we were working with a supplier institute, right? Mm-hmm. And we decided that we needed to do some Taguchi training. And I happened to be the training manager at 2 plants and the quality coordinator, and I was only 33, and I was the only woman. Keep that in mind. Anyway, we had Taguchi come in with Dr. Deming at the same time.
Wow.
And that's a funny story because people didn't understand him when he was talking about orthogonal arrays. He said orthogonal arrays. I said, what did he say? So Dr. Deming got up, and he had the 2 ladies that always was holding him up at that time, help him, you know, to his chair, and he sat down, and then they helped him to the podium. And he was transitioning to from another speaker, and the person in ASQC said, now when Dr. Deming is finished, you'll have to fill out your evaluations at the end. At the minute he said that, you heard, I will not speak if there are evaluations. And he turns around like this and starts going back to the chair. And the man said, but Dr. Deming, I will not speak if there are evaluations. And he said, for those of you who need recertification units for your CQE or other things that you have from ASQ, and you will need to fill out a piece of paper and you can send it back here, I will speak. It was great.
Adrian Bass. I did not have the pleasure of meeting Dr. Deming, but toward the end of his career, I was at Entree Computer Services, and our vice president, Mike Souders, went to one of Dr. Deming's 4-day presentations. We only were able to send one person. And we were already into some of the transformation with Dave Schwinn's help at Entree and with PQ Systems' help. And, you know, Mike was feeling pretty good, and he went to the seminar. And after the seminar was over, he went up to Dr. Deming, and he said, Dr. Deming, I have a question. He said, you know, you talked about how this transformation takes a long time and many years. And Mike said, if your company is really good and doing a really good job, can't you do it a little shorter, like maybe 5 years or something? And Dr. Deming said, actually, it will take a lot longer, probably 20 years. I didn't want to scare everyone.
A lot of people here know me, Jim Manley, and I only got to interact with Dr. Deming just a few times. And at the Red Bead Experiment, I showed my one picture that I pander all over the world, right? But in that picture, for those of you who remember it, I was on a panel. I volunteered to be on a panel sitting across from Dr. Deming. So we were allowed to ask questions, and he would answer. And the moment that picture was taken was right after I was making my point. I really thought I had him cornered, right? He was talking about motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. And he was talking about how money wasn't a motivator. And you noticed in the Red Bead Experiment, we incorporated $100 because we want to prove that if people are properly motivated with money, they can make it happen, right? Of course, you all got the lesson. So I'm sitting there, and I said, I have a question, Dr. Deming. He said, yes. I said, you say money's not important. Yes. I said, but you're charging my company large amounts of money to be here. And I could see my supervisor in the back just cringe, you know. And in fact, at the back of the picture, if I had the picture, it says on the back, only Jim would ask Dr. Deming that question, okay? And my hands are like this, so I'm challenging him. And I will never, ever forget his answer. He said, young man, that's so I know they're serious. He charged the money because he knew that the General Motors executives, the way they thought, only respected one thing. They only respected something that was costly. And he wanted, I think, my opinion, I never asked him, my opinion was he charged that amount of money because he knew it was the only way to reach them. And I've always treasured that moment. It was one of the few moments I got one-on-one with Dr. Deming, but for a young man, I was a young man back then, it was quite a memory for me. Thank you.